For as long as I could remember, that stretch of land on the outskirts of Cedar Valley had been mine, an inheritance from my grandfather, a man who believed in patience, hard work, and the natural order of things. He left me over 300 acres of rolling hills, oak trees, and a quiet stream that fed into a man-made reservoir we had built decades ago. It wasn't just land, it was history, memory, and legacy rolled into one. For years, I kept it as it was. I didn't develop it. I didn't sell it. I simply maintained it, mowing the open fields twice a year, making sure the dam's spillway stayed clear, and keeping the old cabin by the lake in working shape. People often called me foolish for not doing something with it, but I didn't care. The land wasn't for flipping or profit. It was for peace, something this world had forgotten. Then came the HOA. It started innocently enough. A new housing development began a few miles down the road, glossy billboards promising luxury living in nature's backyard. I thought nothing of it. The town was growing and people needed homes. But then the trucks started showing up on my land. At first one or two, then dozens. Bulldozers, concrete mixers, and men in hard hats. I drove out there one morning to find that half my southern field had been cleared. Trees, some of which had stood longer than I'd been alive, were reduced to splinters. The familiar sound of birds and rustling leaves was replaced with the screech of metal and the rumble of engines. When I confronted the foreman, he handed me a clipboard and said, "Talk to the HOA." He pointed toward a temporary office trailer with a banner that read, "Cedar Ridge Estates, Phase II. Inside, I met her Karen Reynolds, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, a woman with a crisp white blouse, a clipboard in hand, and the kind of forced smile that only power can produce. Her tone was sharp, her words deliberate. She insisted that the land was under development and that my paperwork must be outdated. I laughed, at first. Then she showed me the plans. According to her blueprints, my land, the reservoir, the dam, the woods, everything, had been parceled into neat little rectangles, labeled as Lot 18 through Lot 67. My private property had somehow become the expansion site for Cedar Ridge Estates. When I told her she was trespassing, she said the matter had already gone through appropriate channels. I knew that was a lie. My deed was airtight, the taxes current, and the property boundaries unambiguous. Still, she stood there with smug confidence, as if she had already won. I called the county clerk's office, the planning commission, even the sheriff. Each department bounced me around until I realized something sickening. The HOA had powerful friends, investors, lawyers, and politicians who saw dollar signs where I saw oak trees. By the end of the week, 50 concrete slabs had been poured. My land was being stolen before my eyes, not with guns or threats, but with signatures, permits, and arrogance. And the worst part? The reservoir, my reservoir, was being touted in their promotional material as a private, lakeside amenity for Cedar Ridge. Homeowners! They had no idea what they were building. On the dam that held that lake together was old. Strong, but old. Built in the 1960s by my grandfather and a handful of men with little more than grit and shovels. It had held up through storms and floods, but it was never designed to bear the kind of heavy construction the HOA was dumping around it. Every night, I would sit in my cabin and look out over the water, watching the reflection of their construction lights dance across the surface. The air smelled of diesel, and the sound of hammering echoed across the valley. It wasn't just a violation of property. It was a violation of everything my family had built. I tried to fight it legally. I really did. But when your opponents can buy influence faster than you can hire an attorney, justice becomes a luxury. By the time I managed to get a court injunction, the homes were nearly complete. Neat rows of identical two-story houses, freshly painted in warm colors, with driveways and manicured lawns where my wildflowers used to grow. They called it Cedar Ridge Phase II. I called it the graveyard of my family's legacy. But fate has a funny way of balancing things out. Nature, my old ally, was patient just like me. The more they built, the more pressure mounted behind the dam. The construction had interfered with natural drainage. Runoff was collecting faster than it could release. And every time it rained, I could hear the distant groan of concrete and earth beneath the surface, a reminder of what was coming. I didn't plan revenge. Not at first. But as weeks turned into months, and as Karen began holding HOA meetings on my land without permission, boasting about the community's growth, something inside me hardened. One evening, I stood by the dam, flashlight in hand, rain dripping from my hat, and I realized something simple, something inevitable. They had built their empire on borrowed land and borrowed time, and one day soon, nature would come to collect. Weeks turned into months, and the once quiet expanse of my grandfather's land transformed into a buzzing hive of suburban activity. Where deer once grazed and foxes darted between the trees, now stood two-story pastel homes, trimmed hedges, and polished SUVs. The HOA had moved in like an invasive species, spreading, controlling, enforcing. The peace I had once found in those hills was gone, replaced by the hum of air conditioners and the constant chatter of new homeowners bragging about their lake view. I watched from the old cabin on the northern ridge, the only structure they hadn't touched. From there I could see everything. The rows of cloned houses, the sparkling surface of the reservoir, and beyond that, the dam, my dam, holding back millions of gallons of water. It was the last remaining barrier between their illusion of paradise and the truth of what lay beneath it. They had no idea how fragile it all was. It began subtly, almost poetically. After their construction crew paved over natural runoff channels, the earth started to change. Rainwater that used to seep gently into the soil now rushed down in streams, carving new paths, collecting in low spots. The reservoir's level began to rise, slowly but noticeably. The spillway, once clear and free, was now choked with mud and debris pushed in by their reckless grading. I had warned them once, not out of kindness, but out of duty. The dam wasn't meant to handle this kind of abuse, but Karen and her board brushed it off, confident that modern engineering could handle anything. They built walking trails near the base of the dam, benches overlooking the water, and even a children's playground a few hundred feet downstream. It was all for show, a facade of harmony built on ignorance. By mid-spring, the first signs of strain began to appear, a hairline crack along the western edge. Small, almost invisible, but I saw it. The kind of flaw that whispered of pressure, of weight, of something building beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Karen's reign over Cedar Ridge Phase II grew even more tyrannical. She imposed fines for untrimmed lawns, dictated fence colors, and even banned non-approved mailboxes. Residents grumbled, but none dared to challenge her authority. To them, she was the self-appointed queen of suburban order, the protector of property values. I kept to myself, maintaining my cabin and tending the land that remained mine. I wasn't allowed on the developed side anymore. The HOA had even installed a cheap wooden fence marking their property line, though we both knew where the real one lay. At night, when the wind was still, I would walk down to the dam. The sound of trickling water had grown louder, sharper. I could feel the subtle vibration beneath my boots as the flow beneath the concrete quickened. The old structure was talking to me in the only way it knew how, and I listened. My grandfather had taught me that dams, like people, had limits. You could patch them, strengthen them, reinforce them, but once they started to fail, there was no stopping it. The HOA, in their arrogance, began draining water from the reservoir for landscaping and irrigation, thinking it was theirs to use. Pumps ran constantly, drawing the lake down just enough to expose the muddy edges. That's when I noticed something even more troubling. New cracks forming where the foundation met the waterline. Years of erosion had weakened the inner walls, and the vibrations from the constant construction had only made it worse. Then came the storm. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rain, but no one, not even the HOA, expected what arrived. Over 2 days, the skies opened with unrelenting fury. Sheets of rain fell across Cedar Valley, swelling creeks and flooding streets. By the second night, the reservoir was a churning, violent mirror rising inch by inch toward the crest of the dam. From my cabin window, I could see the panic unfold. Flashlights darted across backyards, and homeowners scrambled to move patio furniture and secure their decks. The air was thick with fear, and Karen, ever the commander, stood beneath her umbrella barking orders. She still believed she was in control, but nature doesn't answer to committees. At dawn, the rain eased, leaving behind a heavy silence. The dam groaned under the immense pressure. Water seeped through tiny fissures, dripping steadily down the back face like tears. The soil around the foundation was saturated, dark, spongy, ready to give. I went down to inspect it myself, my boots sinking into the wet earth. The sound was different now, not the steady hum of containment, but a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in my chest, the kind of sound that precedes change, or collapse. I stood there for a long time, watching the water lap against the top edge, the foam swirling like smoke. Every instinct told me this dam wouldn't survive another storm. But then again, maybe it wasn't supposed to. They had taken everything: my land, my peace, my legacy. They had disrespected nature, reshaped it, claimed ownership over something that was never theirs to begin with. And now, nature was preparing to remind them who truly held the power. When the sun broke through the clouds later that morning, it cast a golden shimmer across the reservoir. To anyone else it might have looked beautiful, tranquil even, but I saw what lay beneath: tension, pressure, inevitability. That night I sat in the cabin, listening to the frogs croak and the water whisper through the cracks. I knew what was coming, even if they didn't. And as I sipped my coffee in the dim glow of the lantern, I made a silent decision, one that would change Cedar Ridge forever. If they wanted my land so badly, then they could have it, every last inch of it. But they'd have to take it the way it came: wild, unforgiving, and ruled by nature itself. The dam, old and faithful, had done its job for nearly 60 years. Maybe it deserved to rest. Maybe it was time to let go. As the wind picked up and the water rose again under the next round of storm clouds, I grabbed my old key ring, the one that held the rusted metal handle to the spillway gate. My grandfather had told me never to touch it unless I had no other choice. Well, now I had no other choice. The storm returned with a vengeance. The kind of storm that didn't just fall, it consumed. Wind howled through the valley, bending trees and pelting sheets of rain across the half-finished sidewalks of Cedar Ridge Phase II. The lights in the new houses flickered, and the air hummed with the nervous energy of something that had been waiting too long to happen. I stood by the window of my cabin, staring out across the dark landscape toward the reservoir. The surface of the water, once calm and mirror-like, now heaved under the assault of the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the dam in stark flashes. And with each burst of light, I could see the cracks spreading further along its edge. The time had come. For months, I had watched them take what wasn't theirs. For months I had fought, quietly, patiently, hoping someone in authority would intervene. But no one did. The HOA and its queen, Karen Reynolds, had pushed and pushed, confident that money and influence could tame even nature itself. Now nature was ready to answer back. I put on my raincoat and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at me as I made my way down the muddy slope toward the dam. The flashlight in my hand cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the rough concrete face glistening under torrents of water. The sound was deafening, a deep primal roar of water trying to escape confinement. The reservoir was full, too full. The spillway, clogged with debris and sediment from their careless grading, was no longer functioning properly. The dam was bearing the entire burden, straining against a force it was never meant to hold. At the base, I found the old maintenance hatch, a steel door bolted shut decades ago. The rusted handle felt cold in my palm as I pulled out the ring of keys that had belonged to my grandfather. They were ancient, heavy, and worn smooth from years of use. I turned the largest one, and with a groan that echoed through the valley, the hatch creaked open. Inside, the tunnel smelled of damp earth and history. My flashlight beam danced across the concrete walls as I descended into the narrow corridor that led to the spillway controls. Every footstep splashed through shallow water, and above me, the rumble of the storm blended with the deep vibration of the dam under strain. It wasn't a decision made in rage. It wasn't vengeance in the way people think of it. It was inevitability, the natural correction of an imbalance that had gone too far. The control gate was massive, a wheel of iron and rust that took all my strength to turn. For years it had sat untouched, locked away from the world. But as I put my weight into it, the metal resisted, then yielded with a groan that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Up above, the first tremor of movement began. The sluice gates creaked open, and the water, furious, unstoppable, surged through the channels beneath the dam. The roar grew louder, echoing through the valley like thunder from the earth itself. I stepped back, flashlight shaking in my hand as the old structure came alive. It wasn't collapsing, not yet. It was breathing. The pressure that had built for months was finally finding release. Out in the open, torrents of water shot from the base of the dam, carving deep channels through the muddy earth below. The creek that once meandered gently through the forest now transformed into a raging current. From my position, I could see the glow of the houses in Cedar Ridge. Their perfect lawns were already flooding, their carefully planned drainage systems no match for the sheer volume of water pouring in. The sound of distant car alarms mixed with the crash of falling branches. The storm intensified, rain lashing sideways, driven by wind that seemed to howl with purpose. The water level in the reservoir dropped slightly, but the inflow from the storm was too great. The dam continued to strain, its old seams moaning with every surge. I climbed back up, mud clinging to my boots, and stood on the ridge overlooking it all. Below me, the once pristine development had become a maze of flashing lights and frantic movement. Homeowners ran through knee-deep water, clutching their belongings, trying to save what they could. Karen's SUV was parked near the community entrance, its headlights cutting through the chaos. Even from this distance, I could sense her disbelief. She had built her empire on control. Control over appearances, control over people, control over land that wasn't hers. But control means nothing when the earth decides otherwise. The dam didn't break that night. Not completely. But it was close. The lower slope had begun to erode, and great chunks of soil were peeling away, dragged down by the torrent. The reservoir was still overflowing, and the pressure behind the concrete wall was immense. I retreated to the cabin before dawn, drenched and exhausted. The storm began to wane, leaving behind a valley scarred and reshaped. I sat by the fire, the smell of smoke and rain filling the air, and listened to the faint rumble of water still pouring through the open spillway. When morning came, Cedar Ridge was unrecognizable. Half the yards were submerged. Retaining walls had collapsed. The playground Karen had built near the dam was gone, swept away completely. The HOA's brand-new walking path was buried under mud and debris. And yet, through it all, they still didn't understand what had happened. They called it an act of God, a freak storm, a once-in-a-century event. They didn't realize it was their own doing. Their arrogance, their carelessness, their belief that they could shape nature to their will. I stayed silent. I watched the news crews arrive, the county engineers inspect the site, the HOA scramble to reassure homeowners that everything was under control. But I knew better. The dam wasn't finished. The cracks were deeper now, the foundation weaker. Another storm, even a smaller one, could finish what had begun that night. And that thought didn't fill me with fear. It filled me with peace. The land was reclaiming itself, piece by piece. Nature was taking back what belonged to it. I walked down to the water's edge one last time before dusk, standing where my grandfather once stood decades ago. The surface of the reservoir was calm again, deceptively calm, like a predator resting before the hunt. I ran my hand along the cool, wet concrete and whispered a silent promise to the old structure. When the time came, I wouldn't stop it. The people of Cedar Ridge thought they had built permanence. They thought concrete, contracts, and HOA bylaws could outlast the will of the land. But soon enough, they would learn the same lesson my grandfather had taught me long ago, that nature doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive, and when that final storm arrived, I would be ready. The days that followed the storm were deceptively calm. The skies cleared, the air smelled fresh again, and Cedar Ridge began its desperate attempt to return to normal. Contractors arrived to drain flooded basements, landscapers scraped mud from driveways, and Karen herself strutted through the chaos, clipboard in hand, promising homeowners that the HOA would restore order. But order was an illusion, one that couldn't survive what was coming. The dam had held that night, but just barely. The open spillway had released part of the pressure, yet the damage ran deeper than anyone realized. Beneath the concrete, years of erosion had eaten away at the foundations. The storm had accelerated what time had already begun. Cracks widened beneath the surface, invisible to the untrained eye but loud enough for me to hear in my bones. Every time the wind blew across the reservoir, it carried with it a deep, low hum, the sound of tension straining against inevitability. The homeowners didn't notice, of course. They were too busy arguing over insurance claims, landscaping damages, and property values. For them, the danger had passed. For me, it was just beginning. From my cabin on the ridge, I watched the land shift. The once sturdy banks around the reservoir had turned soft, dark, and unstable. The soil gave way beneath the weight of the houses closest to the water. Fences leaned awkwardly, driveways cracked, and the pristine lawns Karen was so proud of began to sag at their edges. Nature was reclaiming its ground inch by inch. By midsummer, another series of storms began to roll through Cedar Valley. They weren't as violent as before, but they were relentless. Days of steady rain soaked the hills, saturating everything. The reservoir swelled again, slowly but surely, until the water line reached the cracks along the dam's crown. I knew then that it wouldn't take much more. The county engineers had come and gone, inspecting the dam after the last flood. Their conclusion had been predictable: structurally stable with minor repair needs. But they hadn't seen what I saw. They hadn't walked its base at night, listening to the faint hiss of water seeping through fractures. They hadn't felt the tremor in the earth when the pressure built up. I had. The next storm arrived late one evening without warning. A wall of clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the sunset and turning the world a bruised shade of gray. Thunder rumbled across the valley like a slow, distant growl. I stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the first sheets of rain slash across the lake. The surface churned, rising higher, eating away at the banks where the HOA had installed decorative rocks and tiny white fences. The water was no longer gentle. It was restless, hungry. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the treetops. Lightning flickered across the horizon, illuminating the dam for brief moments, each flash revealing the deepening cracks and the water surging over the top. The storm didn't stop. For 12 hours straight, it poured. The rain hammered against my cabin roof, drumming like war. The air grew thick and heavy, and somewhere deep below, I felt the faint, rhythmic pulse of movement, a vibration traveling through the ground, steady and ominous. When dawn came, I went down to the dam. The path was a river of mud, and the air smelled of earth and rain. Water cascaded over the dam's edge now, not just through the spillway but in thin, powerful streams that cut through the weakened concrete. The sound was deafening, a living roar that drowned out everything else. I climbed the slope, my boots slipping in the wet soil, until I reached the top. The reservoir had swollen beyond anything I'd ever seen. The surface stretched wide, nearly level with the dam's crest. Debris, logs, branches, even pieces of broken fencing, floated in angry circles. And there, below, lay Cedar Ridge. 50 houses, all lined neatly in rows, each with its manicured lawn, its perfect symmetry, its promise of suburban perfection. From above, they looked like toys, delicate and breakable. I stood there for a long time, rain soaking through my coat, and I realized something that made my chest ache. This was never about revenge anymore. It was about balance. About the land returning to the way it was meant to be. The HOA had built its empire on false ownership, never once respecting what was already there. And now, that empire was about to meet the truth. The final fracture came with a sound that shook the valley, a deep, thunderous crack, followed by a low rumble that rolled like distant artillery. The ground beneath me trembled. I backed away as the dam groaned, the concrete splitting down its face like a wound tearing open. Then, in a single unstoppable motion, the wall gave way. The water exploded forward with primal fury, a massive surge that tore through the valley like a living thing. Trees snapped like matchsticks, and boulders rolled as if weightless. The roar was deafening, the sound of nature reclaiming what was hers. Down below, Cedar Ridge disappeared beneath a wave of brown, churning water. Houses crumbled under the force, roofs collapsing, cars tumbling like pebbles in a flood. Streetlights flickered and vanished. The playground, the walking trail, the pristine lawns, all gone in seconds. From the ridge, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The reservoir emptied itself completely, its fury unleashed in a single, magnificent moment. The flood swallowed the land, reshaped it, cleansed it. By the time the rain stopped, silence settled over the valley. The air smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. Where the development once stood, there was only water and debris, a vast, shallow lake reflecting the gray morning sky. The HOA was gone. Karen's empire, her rules, her arrogance, all of it erased. The only thing left standing was the old oak tree that had marked the boundary of my grandfather's property. It stood tall amidst the wreckage, its roots deep in the soil that had always been ours. I walked down slowly, each step sinking into the wet ground. The road that once led into Cedar Ridge ended abruptly at the edge of the new lake. Pieces of siding, children's toys, and shattered mailboxes floated nearby. I stood there for a long time, staring at what nature had done. Some would call it destruction. I called it restoration. The land was quiet again, peaceful, the way it used to be before greed and concrete took hold. When the authorities arrived days later, they called it a tragic failure, an accident caused by neglect and structural aging. No one blamed me. No one suspected a thing. The dam had simply done what time and nature demanded. And as the cleanup crews began their work, I retreated back to my cabin, back to the silence that had been stolen from me for so long. The valley would heal. It always did. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't just the end of Cedar Ridge. It was the end of something much bigger, the illusion of control, the arrogance of ownership. It had all been washed away. And standing there on the ridge that evening, watching the sun set over the calm waters that had once been my grandfather's reservoir, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Morning came slowly over Cedar Valley. The rain had stopped days ago, but the clouds still lingered, heavy, gray, and unmoving, like the valley itself was holding its breath. The sound of rushing water had faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of recovery. Birds had begun to return, circling above the flooded basin that used to be Cedar Ridge Phase II. From the ridge above, I looked down at what was left of the HOA's empire. The rows of identical homes were gone, swept away, their concrete foundations torn apart and scattered like driftwood. In their place stretched a new body of water, shallow in some places, deep in others, reflecting the broken light of dawn. The dam was gone too, split in half, its once mighty wall reduced to jagged ruins and debris. The land had changed. It was no longer tamed, trimmed, or symmetrical. It was raw again, free. I stood there in silence, boots planted in the wet earth, feeling a strange mix of grief and calm. Grief for the land my grandfather had once trusted me to protect, and calm because, in the end, I had done exactly that. Not through law or anger, but through the one force that could never be corrupted: nature itself. Down below, the remnants of the HOA community were barely recognizable. Streets were gone. Driveways ended abruptly in muddy channels. Some homes had been completely erased, while others leaned at strange angles, half submerged in the new lake. Cars lay scattered like toys, Fences floated aimlessly near the banks, their white paint streaked brown by silt. The silence was eerie. It wasn't just the absence of human noise, it was the sound of defeat, of nature reclaiming its ground. Within days, emergency crews began to swarm the area. Helicopters buzzed overhead, rescue boats cut across the murky water, and government officials set up command tents on the nearest dry ridge. They called it the Cedar Valley Flood Disaster. News outlets from across the state arrived, cameras rolling, eager to capture the tragedy of a failed dam that had destroyed an entire subdivision. No one ever questioned why that dam had failed after standing for 6 decades. No one asked about the permits, the land boundaries, or the stormwater management plans that had been ignored by the HOA. They only saw the aftermath, and they needed someone to blame. The county engineers blamed age and neglect. The HOA blamed the county. The insurance companies blamed the homeowners for unauthorized modifications, and the homeowners blamed Karen. It didn't take long for the truth about her empire to unravel. Investigations revealed that many of the homes had been built without proper permits. Several environmental reports had been falsified. The reservoir, which had always been private property, had been illegally claimed as a community lake. Even worse, the construction had directly interfered with the dam's drainage system, something that any qualified engineer would have recognized as a fatal risk. Karen Reynolds, the self-appointed queen of Cedar Ridge, found herself at the center of it all. The same woman who had barked orders, written citations, and bragged about owning the best neighborhood in Cedar Valley was now facing a mountain of lawsuits. Her empire of control had collapsed just as thoroughly as the homes she'd built. I watched it unfold from a distance. I never spoke to the media, never gave a statement. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The land was returning to what it had always been, untamed and unpredictable. The county eventually declared the area uninhabitable. The soil was unstable and the water level unpredictable. They called it unsafe for redevelopment. I called it poetic justice. Over the next few months, Cedar Ridge Phase II was officially abandoned. The homeowners who survived took their insurance payouts and left. The HOA was dissolved by court order. The once pristine signs, the brick entrance with the engraved name, the decorative lamps, all of it was dismantled and hauled away. Karen disappeared from public life. Some said she moved out of state. Others whispered that she filed for bankruptcy. I didn't care where she went. She had built her throne on stolen ground, and the land had reclaimed it. For a time, I avoided going near the site. I wanted to remember the valley as it had been before, alive with wildflowers, alive with peace. But one evening, as summer began to fade into fall, I walked down to the edge of the new lake. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of wet soil and pine. The setting sun cast a golden reflection over the water, and for the first time in months, the valley looked beautiful again. Not perfect, never perfect, but alive. Nature doesn't care for perfection. It only cares for balance. I could still see traces of what had been. The broken outline of a driveway beneath the water, the edge of a collapsed fence jutting from the mud. But they were fading, sinking, being swallowed by the land that had once been theirs to conquer. The birds had returned in full force, nesting in the tall reeds that now lined the water's edge. Frogs croaked where backyards used to be. Fish swam through the submerged remains of what was once a cul-de-sac. The land was healing, and with it, so was I. I spent that evening by the water's edge, tossing stones into the lake and watching the ripples spread. The reflection of the sky danced across the surface, and I thought of my grandfather, of the way he used to stand on the dam, watching the sunrise, proud of what he had built. He never built it to last forever. He built it to live with the land, not against it. That was the part they had never understood. The HOA believed they could own nature. That paperwork, fences, and bylaws made them powerful. But power means nothing when the ground beneath your feet decides it's had enough. As night fell, the frogs sang louder, and the crickets joined in. The valley was alive again, chaotic, free, and whole. The media eventually moved on. The county stopped talking about rebuilding. The disaster that had once dominated headlines became another cautionary tale, a warning about greed, arrogance, and ignoring the land's natural laws. And me, I stayed. The cabin still stood, untouched by floodwaters, hidden by trees. I repaired the roof, cleared the trail, and rebuilt the old wooden dock that now reached into the new lake. I didn't need to own the land to protect it. I just needed to respect it. Every so often, when the rain comes and the wind howls through the trees, I hear the faint echo of that night, the roar of water, the crack of the dam, the scream of earth reclaiming itself. And instead of fear, it fills me with peace, because I know that what happened wasn't destruction. It was correction. The land was never theirs to take. And in the end, it reminded everyone of that truth. The HOA, the houses, the ambition, all gone. But the land remains, just as it always was, just as it always will be. The valley had gone quiet again. Months passed, then seasons, and the chaos that had once consumed Cedar Ridge faded into memory. Nature had taken what was hers, reshaped it, and left behind something different, something pure. The flood had not only wiped away the homes and fences, it had washed away the arrogance that came with them. In the spring that followed, the new lake shimmered under the morning sun like a silver mirror. Grasses grew where asphalt once stretched, and saplings sprouted through the ruins of foundations. The sound of engines and lawnmowers was gone, replaced by the soft chorus of frogs and the distant call of cranes. What had once been a neighborhood had become a wetland, rich with life. Time, as it always does, continued forward. The county eventually fenced off the area, declaring it a protected watershed. They posted warning signs: no trespassing, unstable ground, unsafe for development. But I knew the truth. It wasn't unsafe. It was sacred. I visited the site often, though I stayed at the edges. The land didn't belong to anyone anymore. Not to me, not to the HOA, not to the county. It belonged to itself again. Every time I walked the ridge and looked down at that still water, I could almost feel my grandfather's presence beside me. I imagined him standing there, silent and proud, seeing that the land had finally found peace. The newspapers stopped writing about the flood. The lawsuits fizzled out. The developers moved on to other towns, other hillsides, chasing new opportunities to reshape what they didn't understand. But here, in Cedar Valley, there was nothing left to take. The once infamous Cedar Ridge flood zone became a story locals whispered about. A modern myth. Some said it was divine punishment for greed. Others said it was negligence, bad luck, or a freak accident. But no one ever really knew the truth. No one except me. I never told anyone what I had done. Not the sheriff, not the county inspectors, not even the few neighbors who came asking questions in the early days. It wasn't out of guilt. It was out of respect. The dam didn't fail because of sabotage. It failed because the land had been pushed too far. I had merely given it the chance to speak for itself. And when it did, it spoke louder than any court, any lawyer, or any HOA president ever could. Karen's name became a cautionary tale in town. The woman who once ruled over homeowners with iron-fisted authority now existed only in rumor. People said she tried to sue the county and lost everything. Others said she moved away, changed her name, and lived quietly somewhere far from water. I didn't care to find out. Her HOA, her pride and power, had been built on the illusion of control. But control is fragile. You can build fences, pave roads, and dictate the color of someone's mailbox, but you can't command the earth to obey you. That was the lesson she never learned. Years passed. The trees grew taller, the water clearer. The animals returned in greater numbers than before. Deer, foxes, herons, even a family of otters that made their home near the lake's northern inlet. The ecosystem thrived where suburban order had once strangled it. One autumn morning, I walked the familiar path from my cabin to the ridge. The air was crisp, and mist rolled off the lake in pale ribbons. As the sun rose, the golden light hit the surface, and for a moment, I could see the reflection of what once was, the faint outlines of rooftops beneath the water, the remnants of a street sign half buried in silt, the bones of a world that had tried to conquer nature and failed. It wasn't haunting. It was humbling. I realized then that my role was over. I had done what was necessary, and now the land was telling me it no longer needed me to protect it. It could take care of itself. I began to write down the history of the place, not for fame or confession, but for understanding. I wrote about my grandfather, the dam, the flood, the arrogance of the HOA, and the balance that had finally been restored. I wanted anyone who read it, someday, long after I was gone, to see the truth that so many before had ignored, that ownership is temporary, but nature is eternal. As I wrote, the cabin became filled with memories, the scent of wet wood, the creak of the old floorboards, the gentle hum of the lake outside. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice reminding me that land is not something you possess, it's something you belong to. When I finished, I sealed the papers in a tin box and buried it near the old oak tree that had survived everything: storms, floods, and time itself. That tree had marked the boundary of my land for generations, but now it stood as a monument to something far greater. In its roots, the story of Cedar Ridge would rest, not as a tale of destruction, but of rebirth. Years turned into decades. People forgot. The new generation grew up hearing only fragments. Stories about a neighborhood that vanished overnight, a mysterious flood that reshaped the valley. They didn't know about Karen, the HOA, or the greed that started it all. They just saw a lake and a forest, a place untouched, serene, and timeless. And that was enough. I spent my final years quietly, living beside the water, tending to the land like my grandfather once did. I watched the seasons change, the wildlife flourish, and the dam's ruins slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. The land was whole again, and so was I. When the day finally came that I could no longer walk the ridge, I sat by the window of my cabin, listening to the soft ripple of the lake. It was the same sound I had heard as a child, steady, eternal, forgiving. The world had moved on, but here, time stood still. And as the light faded from the sky, I knew one truth above all else: nature always remembers. No matter how deep the concrete, how strong the walls, or how powerful the people who try to control it, the land endures. It waits, and when the moment comes, it takes back what's rightfully its own. The dam, the HOA, the houses, all gone. But the land remained. It always had, and it always would.